I created a 3D printable iPad stand that looks like a retro iMac. Now let's go back to the beginning. I read that Apple is working on a HomePod with a screen. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I saw this render on Mac Rumors and I was instantly hooked. The concept looked like a mix between a G4 iMac and the HomePod, and I loved it. So I started designing my own version of this concept. First I needed a screen. To keep the round corners from the render, I decided to use my iPad Pro instead of a regular screen. This choice greatly simplified the design process, as I didn't need to include a computer. Next I needed an arm. I have a gutted G4 iMac, so I removed its arm, which was quite easy. After that I started designing the base. I began by creating the iMac shape, then added 2 spiral ribs. I copied the ribs 80 times to create the HomePod-like texture. This process pushed my M1 MacBook Air to its limits. It took 10 minutes to compute and I almost aborted the task, but it succeeded in the end. Next I printed the part with adaptive layer heights to make the layers less visible on the top. The texture turned out great and the print quality was solid. After I attached the G4 arm to the base, I wasn't happy with the proportions. The arm was way too big for the base. I decided to create a smaller 3D printable arm instead, so anyone could replicate it at home. I designed a smaller arm and added hexagonal connectors at the top and bottom. To better mimic the old G4 arm, I also included a screw pattern on the side. After comparing it to the original arm, I preferred the smaller version. Next, I had to modify the base by adding the same hexagonal connector to the top. After it was printed, I assembled the parts, and I really liked the combination. I designed a rotatable adapter to connect the arm to the iPad, but this design required a magnetic backplate from an iPad case. Unfortunately, this backplate wasn't 3D printable, and the design looked quite boring when the iPad wasn't there. Additionally, it made squeaky noises with some filaments, so I rejected this idea. Instead, I designed a non-rotatable adapter. I added a pattern to match the base and give it a more interesting look, while also removing the unnecessary parts to save on material. I created a small piece to hold the iPad in place, with a gap for the charging cable that also made swiping up a lot easier. After printing all the parts, I assembled them. The stand looked good, but I wasn't happy with the dark filament. It hid the texture too much. I reprinted it in olive green, and it looked much better. The lighter color made the texture more visible, so I went with that version. Glue was necessary to make the stand stronger. The assembly was quick, taking less than a minute. Once the glue dried, the stand was complete. The stand allows the iPad to be used in both horizontal and vertical mode. I added my iPad and it looked fantastic, like a smaller, modern version of the G4 iMac. The texture on the base and backplate made it really unique. Now let's place it next to the original G4. I think the proportions are quite good, and I really like this olive green color. It's also great for using the iPad as an external monitor with sidecar. I started with a HomePod concept and ended up with a nice iPad stand. Apple's final design will likely be very different. For example, a smaller screen would make much more sense, and the iPad's UI isn't optimized for HomePod functionality. To emulate the HomePod concepts, I created a screen with widgets and shortcuts to replicate a smart home controller. I'm quite happy with the result, but there is room for improvement. A movable arm or a base that doubles as a small container could be great upgrades. But for now, I consider this project finished. If you would like to print this yourself, the files are available on my Maker webpage for free. Thanks for watching and see you next time.